So what are habits? This can give you a sense of it. You've got automatic behaviors in response to cues in your environment. And so this is how it's happening. Roughly half of people's behaviors may be habitual. I suspect the number is actually higher than that. It's been used to explain things as diverse as exercise, cyberloafing at work, be a bad habit, and even negative thinking. Okay? Very broadly relevant. So that's a background for this work that I did with my student, Kieran McCloskey. This is the main study I'm going to present today. And then I'm going to give you, I'm going to reach out from that. It's going to get bigger. It's mostly a theoretical talk, but I've got some data for you. Okay. So in the literature, there are three main factors that we've looked at in terms of what is it that predicts a habit. Mostly it's frequency. Contextual stability is really important, and rewards. So the more you do it, the more likely it's going to be a habit. Okay? The more you do it in a stable context, the more likely it's going to be a habit. And if it's rewarding, you start to see where this is going. The marketers are using these principles for you, right? They're figuring out what those triggers are. They're making you do this. There's money in this equation. Now, our perspective, our addition to it was to focus on the complexity of things. So mainly we thought that these things are more important when it's simple rather than complex, though you'll see we have some nuance for that. Basically, if it's simple for you, you've got the skills to do it. If anyone's gone through PT or something, you probably had a hard time doing it. It was complex for you. Okay? And you can think about all kinds of other ways it works that way. So, and from our review of the literature, we saw that no one had looked at all four of these things at one time. So that was where we were going with this. The three interactions we predicted were these. Basically, we expected that behavioral frequency, stability, and rewards would be more likely to make things automatic for simpler behaviors, not more complex behaviors. Okay? So maybe past habit theorizing has been emphasizing simple stuff rather than the complicated things. So we did an MTurk study, 459 people. We think they were people anyway. And you've got the typical profile of descriptive features that you always see with MTurk. We divided 25 behaviors into 3 groups. There were 4 behaviors that were in each group. And we did comparisons between the groups. It was basically an experiment, but the experiment doesn't matter. You want to make sure that they're not systematically different in some respect, and they were not. This way, we reduce participant demand, and therefore we could have hopefully better data. And then this last thing on the slide is that behaviors are only taken if people engage in the behavior somewhat. I mean, habits really aren't relevant if you don't do it, right? So main measures, we have others, but these are the main ones you'll see presented right now. Of course, frequency, stability, and rewards. You can see how they did that. So how many times a week do you do that behavior? We're not talking about things that are once a year or once every 4 years, though those might also be habitual. Okay. Stability, 8 items from a previous student of mine, Rob Lowe, basically breaking out tact, target, action, context, and time. So the more, those things are all the same, that's more stable. Rewards is positive and negative feelings, physical and emotional feelings related to the behavior. So you can think of, well, how good does it make you feel? Very attitudinal. Complexity, the number of mental and physical steps. This is also taken from a former student of mine. And then we've got the SBRA, which is a very popular report for how automatic it is. When I talk about habit strength, I'm really referring to automaticity. There are other ways to do it. That's a different literature. Okay. We did have personality in there, the mini IPIPs, the big 5. And I'll have one slide later about that. I know there's a personality interest in this group. And then last, a little methods note, we POMP scored the items. They have different minimums and maximums. You've heard of POMP scores before? Put them on a 0 to 100% scale. It's just a linear transformation. Now, when it's 0, it's close to 0, it's close to the low point of the scale. If it's near 100, it's near the high. If it's 50, it's at the midpoint. Okay, simple interpretation. Yeah, this still isn't. Oh, it does work, it's just slow. So if you get the model up here, it looks like this. So things that were behavior invariant were age and gender in the models. Those are just kind of like confounds in the analysis. And then behavior specific things, that's masked over there, sorry. but would be all the rest below this. So we're looking at frequency, stability, rewards as interacting factors with complexity. Simple, right? We've got random effects for behavior and participant, and of course, behaviors are nested in participants. So here's just the numbers of ratings of the different behaviors. And okay, a quick note about the behaviors. The 25 were drawn from the literature, mostly. We added a few in that were favorite behaviors of our own preferences. So I added in playing music, literally performing music. So rock and roll, right? If that's your thing. For me, it's more classical, but that's all right. The pink ones were in all three groups. And so you can see, like hand washing, almost everyone did it. And I wonder about the 3 who didn't. Okay? Exercise, was like 2/3, and medication use about half. The smoking one, if we didn't have it across all 3 groups, we probably wouldn't have enough data to really analyze that one. Okay? In fact, in retrospect, I wish we had put texting and driving in because that's very rare. So we learn from doing research, right? And so you get a sense. So the dark bar ones, this is the maximum possible. And so you can see that these are also very frequent behaviors. Food safety practices, sitting, everyone sits. What else? IT use, well, we know what IT. And actually, that's maybe wrong. I might have a wrong label in there, but forget it, doesn't really matter. So that gives you a broad sense of the background of this. And note that the level of perceived behavioral control is very high for these. And this is the TPD items that were in there too, intentions as well. These are intended behaviors, yet they have this automatic component. Okay. TPD is theory of planned behavior, if you haven't heard of it. Now, I think descriptively, it's fun to just look at all the behaviors in one swoop. So there are frequency, rewards, complexity, habit, strength ratings all at once on one graph. And I don't know, I don't think I can turn off the camera on the screen, unfortunately. But way over on the right there is sitting. We've rank ordered these from automatic to the least automatic. So over on the left, seafood consumption, alcohol drinking, exercise, those are not very automatic. And the ones over on the right, food safety practices, hand washing, sitting, very automatic. Okay? You could pick out your favorite behavior of all of these. I like to say to people, there's something for everyone in this talk. There's some of these habits you do, right? And you can kind of think, would I react the same way to these? And kind of fit yourself into the picture. Here they are rank ordered by reward. So on the negative end, negative self-thoughts, very face valid, right? That one should be the most negative probably. And texting and driving right next to it. People know it's not a good thing to do, yet a certain proportion do. I mean, profound. And then way over on the right, my favorite, of course, masked out there by the video, but it's playing music. Okay? And right after that, playing video games, and then seafood, you can see, I think at that point, seafood consumption. So again, very face valid. Here they are rank ordered by complexity. So over on the simple end, sitting, what could be simpler than sitting? Okay, unless you've got some bizarre injury. On the very right end is exercise, and texting and driving, playing video games, playing music, complicated things that involve a lot of multitasking. Right? Again, very face valid, right? So sitting, hand washing, unhealthy snacking over on the left, so simple behaviors. I think that you could imagine, because these are perceptions of complexity in this case, or whatever you're looking at, you could think about different audiences that would rate it differently. I think if you had physicians or people in medical training, they might think of hand washing as more complicated. Imagine a surgeon, how long do they scrub before going in? And after the pandemic, maybe we all think of it a little more complicated too. All right, and this was all pre-pandemic. All right, so, whoops, too fast. There you go. So we confirmed all the things that we thought would predict in the main effects model. All of them predict in the right order. More frequency, more automaticity, simpler, more automatic, more rewarding, more automatic, more stable context, more automatic. And 2 of our interactions came out. They look like this. So the more they're rewarding and complex, the more steep the association, the dark blue bar. Simple ones, it doesn't matter as much. A lot easier to automatize to a simple behavior. And then the one over on the right, the more stable the context, the more the habit strength, especially for the same thing here. So the complex one actually has a higher peak, right? Which we didn't actually predict. More on that in a second. There we go. So did I miss the slide? No, that's, I think, oh, yeah, that's it. So rewards were associated with habit strength. And this effect was stronger when behaviors were complex. This is my favorite prediction of the whole thing. I mean, I play classical music. It can be really tough to play. And I find it rewarding. So it was like my own little life out in front of me here. And intention didn't mediate that. We looked at it. So we wonder if maybe habit initiation looks different than habit maintenance. About the time we're doing the same study, Judah et al. Came out and found exactly what we were theorizing. That as they're practicing the behavior, if it's rewarding, then it perpetuates it. Now, the stability and contextual stability effect was not as strong. Well, oh, we got the crossover effect, yeah. We wondered if this was maybe an artifact of measuring the perceptions. These aren't really actual, it's how people perceive it. It's not actual objective ratings. So maybe it's an artifact of the perceptions. And here's where, if I can advance, we're going to Dunning-Kruger. So the famous effect is that people with a little bit of knowledge think they know everything and act overconfident because of it. And then as they gain real expertise, it slides down, right? Oops, this is more complicated than I thought it was. And then as you gain true expertise, trust me, it's complicated is kind of a thing. So in our data, across all of the behaviors, you did see a little uptick for, and this isn't POM-scored, apologies, but people who have more experience with behavior tend to rate it as more complicated. And one in particular, this is exercise, even more peaked, okay? In fact, we presented these results to a kinesiology group at UConn, and these are like the experts of the experts, right? They found this completely intuitive. They think about all kinds of nuances, all kinds of different people trying to exercise, et cetera. And so it gets more complicated as you get more into it. Yeah, could be, exactly. Yep. Right, like if I so you're asking, doesn't it depend on the perspective of the person? Right, exactly, could mean almost anything. And in fact, in this literature, the scholars tend not to call it exercise because that's ambiguous. They tend to call it physical activity. And so there's lots of perspectives that can come to bear on it. Exactly right. Probably most of these you could. I already mentioned hand washing. Physicians are probably going to look at it far different than you or me. So see, is that good for now? Oh, it's probably actualities too. That it's not just how they're seeing it, it affects how they do it as well. I think that's true too. I learn a lot of things from my kinesiology colleagues. It's true. All right, so a couple of specific behaviors to break out of the whole set. So here's exercise on top and hand washing on the bottom. And some things are parallel between. I've highlighted the yellows to show where they're not so much. In fact, with exercise, the more complicated it is, the more automatic. Maybe apropos to your comment, people learning about it as they become more expert, and it changes how they interact with it, maybe because of the reward thing we talked about. Meanwhile, for hand washing, rewards matter. It looked like rewards don't matter for exercise, but they do for hand washing. Wow, what a sensual pleasure to use alcohol on your hands instead of soap. I don't know, I'm just imagining. So there are some little things that happen. It's good to keep in mind the overall results I gave you are overall, collapsing across everything. So hand washing here is an example. In fact, people who see it as more complex are more likely to be automatic. The crossover went that way. One last exemplar, sitting. It's supposed to be bad for us. Everyone should stand up. Apparently there are ways around that. If you move a lot, between sitting bouts, it's not so bad for you. What do you think predicted sitting, the automaticity of sitting? Back there? Probably nothing, because there's, well, it might be a ceiling, it's possible. Nothing. You were right. I want to talk to you later. So, all right, so some initial conclusions is that we confirm mostly what we expected to see is that the basic recipe's out there. You can create a habit by putting in a stable context, do it frequently, make it rewarding, and keep it simple. Behavioral complexity interacts with rewards and contextual stability. Simple behaviors can become automatic without a lot of context stability. Imagine gum chewing, for example. Really tough habit to break, I think, because of that. And it takes more of a reward to make a complex behavior automatic, right? Now, what about, wait, oh yeah, and a quick reminder that these are happening for behaviors people saw as quite intended. So it's not like they're out of your control, but they're just triggered automatically and then they, whoosh, off they go. So we confirm the two interaction effects like this. And then there's one that we did not. Why? Well, here's where I would go out and look at the neuropsychology literature. And I get my slide to advance. Here's how it works inside your head. You got basically the research on habits has shown that they're located mostly in the striatum. They're all over your brain, but most of the activity they see in their scanning is in the striatum. And especially the DLS is the dorsolateral striatum, which is not really so connected to prefrontal cortex or orbital frontal cortex. So it's an ancient part of your brain you share down the animal kingdom tree. It's something that probably isn't very conscious. It's something that's not going to be picking up things like complexity. It's frequency. It's a drumbeat. Okay. And so this would be my theory why we don't see this interaction showing up. And actually, it's an interesting thing about habits, because if it's mostly primitive mechanisms in the brain we're talking about, well, maybe we're getting too complicated in thinking about changing behavior sometimes. Okay. All right. So there are some limitations with this work. The measure for automaticity was only automaticity. It wasn't cue behavior associations. And so there's a whole different literature on this. And then we should wonder how reward should be conceptualized. Should they be intrinsic to the behavior? What about extrinsic? Does it matter if you're exercising and a friend is there? Things like that. You might not like the exercise, but you might like hanging around with people who are there. So the fact that habits tend to be a little bit primitive suggests it wouldn't matter what kind of reward. That's intriguing. And obviously cross-sectional. And here's where I would come out and say, well, when are these habits being formed? You guys are most of you, all of you are a lot younger than me. When are you making these habits? You know, texting and driving is certainly going to be from what, 15 on, but a lot of them are going to be when you're a kid. And mostly we've got adults looking back at them. So as far as I can tell, there hasn't been a lot of developmental research on this problem. So that's a direction for future research. And then I didn't point this out, but I implied it a few times, is that simple behaviors tend to be the ones that are bad habits. Did you notice that? Marketers are completely on that. They figured it out. Just make it simple and you'll drive behavior. You're using that primitive part of your brain, it just doesn't matter. So there's a confound in it. Now we've done some further work on it. This was a prospective study that we did 2 years ago. And indeed, we replicated the frequency and context stability aspects. We had college undergrads who chose one of 10 behaviors to do a new habit, things like exercise, meditation, practicing a new skill. And generally, we saw the slope where earlier behaviors matter more for making something automatic. And then over time, you get less and less of an effect. It's not linear, it's curvilinear. This was an experienced sampling study over about 7 weeks. We didn't find that reward and complexity mattered, so that's a question, maybe too small of a study to detect. It's hard to tell. But at least we have some perspective on. Now here's gonna get it back to the theory. So if you want to start a habit or stop a bad one, let's go out and think about the big picture. So I went looking for exemplars of people who do things right. And I first, the thing is, if you're acting good, you don't tend to get pressed for that. The news doesn't care. So I drew from my own experience, and here's a dear friend of mine, Lynn Bloom, who's an emerita distinguished professor at UConn. And my students used to, when she was still at UConn, she's retired since, she retired at 80. My students used to come up and tell me about her. She's at the gym every morning swimming. She goes out and recruits her social network to help keep her happy. Things like that. She just looks at things and it's like mind over matter. Okay? So she would say this, and some of these are actually her words. When I want to start a new healthy habit, I just do it. Sounds like Nike. I don't understand people who can't manage it. Views of the old, as she's literally quoting a famous writer here, crippled, almost bald, stooped, shaky, living in a crowded single room are unacceptable to me. Beautiful, isn't it? This is like mind over matter, like I said. Now, I went looking for bad boys of habit, and I was thinking of really rock and rollers or something, and they get all kinds of press. And so the exemplar I came up with first try, if my computer will catch up with me, Keith Richards, Rolling Stones, who's notorious for abusing any number of drugs, smoking ad infinitum, and he's lucky to be alive. Look at his face. The tracks of his habits are visible to you right there. See, in a fairly dated photo, he's gone more pale in the mean. He's still alive, and this was a couple of years ago. I have a quotation here from him. I was surprised to learn that he had actually done the right thing. Here I'm quoting him a couple of years ago. Nicotine was harder to quit than heroin. Quitting heroin is like hell, but it's a short hell. I mean the actual process. Cigarettes are always just there, and I've always done it. I just pick them up and light them up without even thinking about it. That's a habit. Okay? Maybe there's a craving. That's when the primitive mechanism reaches consciousness, right? So that's about it. But here he's just like click whir. And Bob Cialdini used to put it that way. And boom, you've got the behavior, and it's really hard to quit smoking more than heroin. Think about what we know about habits. If it's like one you've generalized across contexts, smoking you used to be able to do everywhere. Gradually, societies constrain that. It's a good thing that they've done it. Okay, so on this subject, you could think about my two case studies as having extreme personalities. So Kieran, like I pointed out, had a personality measure, the big five in the study. So the very same sample of people. And now we look at two main traits, conscientiousness and neuroticism. So it's my friend Lynn, conscientious, self-control. And of course, not my friend so far, but Keith Richards on the neurotic side. So indeed, conscientiousness tends to protect against the automaticity of negative health behaviors. People with self-control realize it's going to get them in trouble, and then they avoid making a habit of it. It's like me in video games, because I know I'm just going to get addicted. Neuroticism, meanwhile, predicts greater automaticity across behaviors, whether they're healthy or unhealthy. So neurotic people tend to be driven by a lot of quirky habits. Neurotic, right? So there it is. And don't get it wrong, but both neurotic and conscientious individuals do have habits too. It's not like they're absent and conscientious people, just not as to the front, if you will. So that's the personality side. And I should point out, I've got QR codes for these things that people are watching online, want to see. Everyone reaches up their phones, but whatever. So how well are we doing at changing behaviors would be a direction I would take this next. And this is where I spent a lot of my career. So here's a famous psychological bulletin paper, Webb and Sheeran, 2006. They went out and looked at interventions that significantly changed intentions to do whatever behavior. And then they examined how much the behaviors corresponded with that. Okay, really elegant. I could quibble with the methods, but an elegant design for a meta-analysis. And indeed, they did show, oh, okay, quick. Here are the behaviors that they examined. Just put in a word cloud, you can see where the emphasis is. So we've got sex, we've got drugs. We don't have rock and roll in that one, but we're close. You've already had rock and roll, you've got Keith Richards. And indeed, in their models, they show that, let me go to the next slide because it shows it again on the right side of the screen. Intention change, behavior change does happen. Overall, this is a result. But there's a finding that was in their study that was underemphasized. My favorite finding from this study, this meta-analysis. And that is that they broke out the results by whether habitual control of the target behavior was likely or unlikely. So when it was unlikely, you saw a big effect size, almost formally large. And if it was likely habitual control, you saw a small effect size. I think the story is significance, but this is a small effect size. You wouldn't be able to see that if you were just looking at the raw data. The one on the left could be easy. You don't need statistics for that. So the likely behavior ones, the likely habitual control ones, is basically showing you that fighting habits is really tough. And those behaviors, meanwhile, are likely more complex too. And the examples are things like smoking and exercise. Okay. Now, we did a big meta review. I mean, I've been doing meta-analysis forever. You mentioned meta reviews, meta-synthesis kind of stuff. You know, when everyone starts doing meta-analysis, the old-fashioned meta-analysts go up a level. I'll just do a meta review instead of a meta-analysis. That's how we remain cool. Okay. So we did this huge meta review. I'm not sure I would ever recommend doing such a large one as this. We actually screened over 12,000 abstracts for this meta review. Only 66 qualified, but that's still a big meta review. And so they went out looking at self-regulation. And that's really what we're talking about with changing behavior. It's like change intentions, can you change behavior? It's all one thing. Well, we've got this literature, and I don't think much has changed since our sample of studies. And there you can see a rundown of what was in our review. 66 qualified, 2.5 million people in these interventions. We should be able to learn from this, right? Some intervention components were successful, like personalized feedback, goal setting, self-monitoring. But each of those only work for some behaviors in other populations, not necessarily universal. The question I would ask, and I went back to, in preparing this talk to look at this, is how many of them examine predictions about habits? Were they using the literature or not? You can guess the answer because it's the girl in the room, right? None. And the exception would be like literatures with drugs, smoking. They would often, the scholars would allude to habits, but they weren't using the literature. Okay. So they weren't engaging in the kind of factors I gave you at the outset. So moving to the third phase then, let's use the habit literature and see what it implies about changing behavior. So first of all, the behavior is performed often. If you're going to make it a habit, it's got to be performed often, same context, got to be rewarded, and make it simple. It's such a simple recipe for getting a behavior the way you want it. This should be really great news for all of you. You want to start something, just do this. And intellectuals, people who are studying like you, probably have an easier time than the general population. So what does all that imply? Infrequent behaviors have little chance to change and succeed and change in the long run. If you don't do it in the same context, you're going to have trouble generalizing. I think this is a principle for starting simple and then make it more complicated over time. If it's rewarded, that means that you've got to make it feel good, or you've got to have some kind of long run benefit to succeed. Working in the gym on muscle building, it's only like a month or two in that you start to feel like you're getting somewhere, stuff like that. It might take time. And as I've already implied, marketers are already doing this kind of stuff. They're making money on this. So the couple of caveats here. The habits literature implies that habits are going to be more feasible when the desired habit does not conflict with existing habits. So you don't want to run straight into an opposing habit. Makes sense? Okay. And it implies that it's more feasible when they're complementary to current habits. So you build on existing habits, that helps a lot. There's some direct evidence on that one. And I think there should be more research on that stuff. But what about other literatures? So the broader context would be something like this. Behavior change should be easier under certain known circumstances. One, stress is low. You guys are about to hit finals, the stressful time for the professors too. Probably not the time to start a new habit. Reminded like that film Airplane. It's like I picked the wrong day to quit painkillers and so on. So keep the stress low. Keep the resources high. So you need high skills or enough skills. You need enough time to act deliberately, at least at the outset. You need ways to make the tasks simpler. And as I mentioned earlier, if you're aging or disability might imply lowered resources and increased complexity. It's going to be hard to change habits. And you see where I'm going with this. I want you to think about allied networks to the target person. If they're complementary, it's going to be easier to change behavior. If they're the opposite, it's going to be harder. And interventionists just aren't doing this. And so I'm going to introduce you to my model. It's a network individual resource model. Done 10 plus years ago for HIV prevention. We have the hooks in here for AIDS care. We have the hooks in here for biological factors. You know, there are networks of biological contagions that would try to attack you. So we tried to go after it. And so to give you a broad background for this theory, which I'm trying to do a version 2 now. So I think of this talk as kind of, well, what are we missing in an IR model? Habits is one of them. So even our group didn't have habits in mind when we did the model. Okay. So that was HIV prevention, but in the big picture, there are these ecological models. You've seen these concentric circles, right? You've got the broader ones here, societal kind of stuff, all the way down to individual. If you Google this, you'll find a million versions of this. You know, everyone always attributes them to Bronfenbrenner. I don't think he ever made one of these. I've looked at the 79 book, it's not in there. So, and I would tend to think of these boundaries as very permeable, intermixing dynamically. And so with the NIR model, I would look more like this. Individuals and networks are sharing resources. They're sharing economic means, they're sharing socio-emotional rewards. And it might be a trade of those things. The individuals are sustaining the networks are sustaining the individuals. They interact over time. And if my clicker would go as fast as me, I'd be happy. They interact over time, and they also interact over lifespans. So momentarily, in the ecological model, we have to worry about people's needs. If you're not very hungry because we've got a lot of food, but if you were, you're going to function a little differently. You don't want to be in a courtroom when the judge is hungry. Research has shown, for example. It has to do with lifespans too. An infant needs care. They cannot exist without it. So it's reciprocal. You've got the individuals helping the networks, and it depends on their phase of life, where they are. An infant's going to be different from a toddler, from a child to an adolescent across the lifespan. And basically, I like to say it really does take a village. If the individuals don't support a network, that network will disappear. Both networks and individuals have lifespans. Facebook won't exist forever. Okay? Probably. So there's a brief take on it. So shouldn't we be thinking about this in our interventions? Is the direction I would take this. And here I would point out that trials take place, and you go out to intervene, people live somewhere. They're at a certain time and space. And you could get more abstract with this, but I don't think you need to. Once they leave the intervention, they're going home, or they're going to work, or they're going to have leisure somewhere else. So are they going to encounter friendly environments, or are they going to find antagonistic ones? So those who agree with the intervention and want to change the behavior in some way might actually be deviants. Is it going to work? And our model says, no, you're fighting the network. You need to change the whole network in that case. So we think we should really be thinking about the habits of the target person, yeah, but also their networks. So borrowing from Blanton and Christie, these are their images. Imagine a kid deciding whether to smoke or not. and they get an intervention at school. What if at home they're surrounded by smokers? I think you're doomed. You need to change the network. If they're surrounded by non-smokers, well, again, it's going to be the opposite pressure. And there are extensions of this very same point we could talk about. Not to delay it. Now, I want to propose to you that networks, that norms and culture are basically network habits. We don't generally call them that, but isn't that what culture is? Isn't that what especially organized norms are? So here's, Tony, you found this paper. And so I'm going to show off. So one example, the closest one you get to big data in this particular talk. We were invited to write a commentary for clinical psych and science and practice. And the target article looked at cultural sexism. And they looked at whether interventions that took place in the States work better or worse for girls in places that were more sexist or less sexist. So I'm going to show you the state's cultural sexism. And that's based on 2 million plus responses from Project Implicit mostly, but some from the General Social Survey as well. So the target authors did this, price it all. That was the most interesting part of the equation for me. And they gave the data state by state. It's like, whoa, here we go. And I was like, well, is it really sexism? So my first thought, and I worked with my student on this, and we both agreed that this should not, we thought that in tight places, you would see more sexism. Well, this comes from Michelle Gelfand's work. So the version that we looked at was the 2014 paper in HENNESSY, where they looked at actual state policies and practices across the 50 states. I think the District of Columbia was out of it, but we deduced what the levels would be from them. So it's things like, are they dry or wet with alcohol? Do the schools allow corporal punishment? Is there hitting in the schools? I mean, is it punished? Things like that, and a bunch of other things. Okay? They built an index about it. And we found that there's a correlation of 0.79 between those things, which is a nice big correlation. What does this say? You can pick your favorite state across this whole range and see if it matches your expectations. The zeros in here, the unfilled ones, are places where no interventions had been done. So it's more specific to the commentary. But basically, intuitively, it made lots of sense. In California, the loosest place of all, unless it's the District of Columbia. And the tighter ones are deep south places. You could put a Mason-Dixon line on there, and probably you could go and think politically on which ones are right and which ones are conservative and which ones liberal or blue or red. And I bet you it's about the same. In fact, cultural sexism was correlated 0.65 with the degree to which they were slaveholding in 1860. These are some long-held norms and practices. And so it kind of leaves me to think, well, gee, if you're going to do any kind of intervention in a place like this, if you're fighting those norms, how could it succeed without going bigger? So then, like, last year with all the racial demonstrations, you actually start to see a structural intervention taking place. So it's not like it never happens, but if you're just an isolated intervention going in, you're probably going to fail. Or maybe you have to find some ironic way to work with them. Be smarter than the norms somehow and get it started. And probably a lot of movements start that way. So in a rational world, we would just train you to identify when you've got a bad habit. You'll just notice it. Some of these I notice, right? Like my bad habit with NPR News. Coming to Canada, I don't have the same cues. I can break my habit. I get relief. I can ignore my editorial responsibilities for a while until they pile up so much that I have to work on them again. But then we just act to modify them, replacing them with healthy habits. And now you know the recipe for that. Just enact the new simple behavior frequently in the same context with rewards. Probably over time, do it in more contexts. Boom, you've got the healthy habit. We know from the research that conscientiousness helps there. But we know that not all behaviors are simple or work. And some replacement habits are not as rewarding as the ones that they're replacing. That's not shown in the data I've given you today, but it's out there. Neuroticism hurts. So we know that there's some factors like that. And we know the network factors almost have to be, but people haven't been researching that. So There are a couple more things I'll add to this equation, 3 more problems. So one problem is people may lack knowledge about what's the best course of action. In health psychology, we have social determinants of health research. So things like smoking is known to damage health, correlation of 0.3 or so, maybe a little smaller than that. Being connected to positive social networks is actually a larger effect size. Lonely people suffer very badly. General public doesn't know that. General public in the West, at least, also underestimates the power of vaccinations. Those 2 factors together would almost predict what happened in America, at least, and how COVID could become politicized. So sometimes people just might not realize and might be ignorant to the actual truth in things. And I would ask you in the larger picture, what does it mean to have a small, medium, or large effect? So was the perceiver looking for an effect? If not, they might miss it. Of course, there are these famous demonstrations of this. So Chabris and Simon's gorilla study, playing with the ball, and the gorilla trots through, and half the people miss the gorilla. It's a large effect size, and they're missing it, right? And actually, you could go back to Nisbet and Wilson, 1977. It's classic, compelling, I think, even though it was a narrative review, a demonstration that people screw up all the time in perceiving things, right? Make the wrong inferences about lots of stuff. And okay, so you could kind of ask, is it a bad habit on the part of scholars? And maybe they're looking at the wrong things. Our theories are not incorporating it, so they're focusing on the wrong things. Right? Take your favorite old-time theory, theory of planned behavior, social cognitive. They're not looking at habits. Social cognitive has the skills in it, but that's it. Theory of planned behavior has social norms in it, but not actual norms, and so on. Yeah. So denial is going to be a problem. This group will appreciate this one. Motivated reasoning gets in the way. So people think it just doesn't matter. How much I smoke today, it won't kill me today. One more cigarette won't do it. Of course, over time, it piles up. So maybe you don't believe it needs to be changed. So you can just have the wrong facts. And it makes me wonder, this is a sidebar, but I think an important one. Social psychologists were really, really happy back in the late 50s when Festinger and Carl Smith's study showed people were more motivated by a $1 reward than a 20, because the learning and memory people couldn't predict that, at least not right away. So did we give up all of that stuff? We stopped thinking about reward value per se and just move on? That's the way it looks. We lost our way. So maybe we were kind of being stubborn about some ironic predictions, and we threw the baby out with the bathwater. The large effect size. So who's the most famous person these days with bad habits? Ed Sheeran. It's a #1 hit, wasn't it? And the video is clipping it here, but every pure intention ends when the good times, I'm not going to sing this. You don't want to hear that. Every pure intention ends when the good times start, falling over everything to reach the first time spark. It started under neon lights and then it all got dark. I only know how to go too far. Social pressures, the price of fame, and some awareness. He's writing about bad habits. He's thinking about bad habits lived. And again, we've got a success story with him. What did it take in his case? If you know the story, I just learned this in the last week. I'm not that contemporary. But he says that the biggest motivation was having his young daughter. I think this is where the generation gap starts, is when you have kids. Now you've got to act good. But he lost a lot of weight when he stopped drinking every day. It's a habit. He probably stopped partying too, but that wasn't the headline. So social psychology might have a bad habit, and all of us might have bad habits, and this is the way you come to grips with them. So there's some help there. So you got over the denial. Then there might be stigma too, because with a lot of bad habits, you don't want to admit, even once you know that it's bad, should I get help? That looks bad. So the stigma against seeking help in mental health areas especially is really big there. Now those two, this one, stigma and denial, imply that we really need things like mindfulness bolstering interventions. Maybe they should be part of interventions, because now you get that self-awareness you need. Now you get the understanding of the triggers So when a trigger happens in your head, you realize, oh, that's my primitive brain talking, and I should find a way to redirect it. Things like humility training, self-affirmation, mindfulness meditation, I'm sure there are others would be in this. And that would be a creative way to go forward. Of course, we already know that if you're going to do this, you want to have rewards be very high if it's a complex behavior. So, some general conclusions. And please, questions and discussion after all this. I'd argue habit is really crucial for our health, both short-term and long-term. It's underexplored, it's the gorilla in the room in terms of understanding really behavior change in general. It doesn't have to be just health behavior. A lot of the research emphasizes health. And that's both empirically and theoretically. It's deserving of a lot more attention. So thanks to my friend Lynn. And I'll also thank some other people. So I've made a habit out of directing thesis and dissertation students on this subject. So especially Kieran was influential for this. Obviously, all the other support sources. I'll thank my family too, because I discuss these things with them and we watch our own habits. And I learn from that stuff. This is good habits, by the way. And here's my general group, and I talk with them about all this kind of stuff too. So questions, discussion, and thank you for your attention. I thought you would have noticed. I don't mean to put that student down, it's a joke.
That's great. Thank you so much. So one thing I was talking about is just the behavioral sequence, like it's being used as a predictor, but it also seems like part of the definition or distinction from other habits. And so do you think that or is it no longer relevant?
Well, there's this classic problem in looking at habit and the reason it fell out of vogue in part was because, and this is trying to repeat your question, is because you're using past behavior to predict future behavior. And so if you're using the very same variable, of course it predicts best of all, right? It's just psychometrically identical. It's just you've got a gap of time in between them. So yeah, this is a fundamental problem with the area. I don't know a good way around it, do you? So I think it's I think you have to be aware of this. When you can find independent measures of the things, you can start to get some angles that indeed there's something there that isn't just the behavior. You know what I mean? In this case, the research we showed you today is perception that I do it a lot. It's their own mental counting of it. But you got to wonder about the validity of that, because if it really is getting automatic, you probably don't realize you're doing it. With COVID, people kept talking, well, you're touching your eyes all the time or your nose, and therefore you're picking something up and you might give yourself COVID. Like the studies on the show you touching your face 25 times an hour or something like that, not aware of it. So some things are so automatic. I found myself looking for my mask and, oh wait, I've got it on. Or looking around for my glasses because I must have lost them and there they are on top of my head. So it's just something you've done so much that you lose track of it. So my guess is that concern would actually make the effects larger, not smaller, if you could get the actual side. But I'm not sure I'd want to be in a study that got the actual side. There was back there.
Yeah, I think, like, I did some research with Oldham and back in Berlin on habits. We often talk about cue behavior link. So there's a cue and if you automatically respond to behavior, that's your habit. And this kind of solves the problem of automatic behavior, because we often would engage in the behavior a lot, but very different cues that might not be a habit in this sense of a habit, but really about cue behavior relationship. And my question is a little bit about you were talking about behavior frequency, but thinking about cue or context. We did a bit of a study where we asked people from a hand-washing behavior habit, and many people choose all the time when they want to use their phone, they should wash their hands before. And we found this is the cue that happens very often. People could not form a habit based on this. We actually found that having a cue that happens a lot of the time is actually bad for habit development, while cues that happen a moderate amount of time is way better.
Oh, that's neat. That's neat. Yeah, I would be curious to see more of that. That's something we haven't been paying attention to that might be important for some studies we're planning right now. So if you can share that with me, that would be great. Yeah. Yeah, and behavior future. Yeah.
But every time you experience that cue, you perform a behavior. So it's still becomes a habit.
So, well, sometimes you find all the things are confounded with each other too. I mean, I remember a friend I met at a conference who only smokes at conferences. There's a cue. It's like, well, that's only a few days a year, right? So how bad can it be? But it's a context. Oh, I'm thinking that's confounded with. It's got to be some developmental thing where I don't want to get into it. but good point. Thank you. Yeah.
I got your discussion on communal habits, I think, especially because a lot of the literature and even popular showing of the individual and the habits, we also know the environment affects us a lot. And so in line of that, like when we're thinking about getting rid of communal habits or adding on to communal habits, we're talking about like big systemic problems, like let's say cultural sexism. When you think about breaking a bad habit versus adding good habits, like what do you think is the approach? Like, is it better to think about, let's like remove bad, like sexist habits in the workplace versus let's add these like pro people or like, you know, more egalitarian habits, like breaking versus forming habits?
So I think it's being creative with the norm. So how do you handle a you know, like Black Lives Matter was big fast, but for generations it was already unfolding too. And literally, if you think about the prejudice and discrimination side of things, a lot of the scholars in that area talk about the old-fashioned redneck racism is literally dying out rather than changing. So then the younger generation is carrying forward a remnant of it. It's still there, but it's not as bad. And then finally, there's a tipping point where enough whites are agreeing with the downtrodden side that boom, you've got a tidal wave. That's Black Lives Matter. But cultural sexism, I don't, you know, we've seen cultural change there too, the Me Too movement. And so, but I see that as more like norm building. It's victims coming forward and then finding allies, and it just grows and grows and grows from there. So it's, you know, for me, looking at U.S. culture, maybe it's like, I think global too. This is neat to see, and it makes you realize that even if cultural sexism is so, I mean, that graph I showed you had 5 standard deviations of sexism on it. That's a vast difference between those states. I'm curious if it's shrunk much. I mean, those data probably go back about 5 years, so they wouldn't reflect the current changes, and not, you know, the Me Too stuff. I don't think that answered your question. So,
yeah, I mean, the norm building, like, is it better to just go into a space and like stop these bad habits versus add on these habits? Like habits, like adding on habits is breaking habits from a public policy.
yeah, I think I would want to look at the problem in question. And you know, you hear case examples of this. There's a mayor in Oklahoma who realized his population was overweight or obese. You know, they were named they were shamed as one of the fattest places in America. And so they went on a community-wide diet and exercise program, and they went off the list. Success. So sometimes simple drawing attention to the problem could be enough to get enough people behind it, and then even if people are reluctant, they can, you know, join in. So but that would be change from within. It's on the ground. That's beautiful. Yeah. All right.
Actually, I ask you exactly that. The question was exactly the example you gave. I was intrigued by your analysis.
Yeah.
That's one way to think about it. But another way to think about it is the Oklahoma example, right? That norms constrain prevention. Is there any that part of your model, or do you think, for example, are habits easier to break if they come from normative, for example?
Thank you. You know, so traditionally, what people have done, like sexual minorities, have just fled places. where it's hard to live as a sexual minority. And that's why San Francisco is an enclave, or Provincetown, Massachusetts on Cape Cod. People get out of the painful environment and just move away rather than stay behind and change it. I think that's why Mark Hetzenbuehler was part of that project with Price. And I forget where it was in here, somewhere around there. Whatever. I should know my slide numbers better than that, so forget it. Anyway, the point was cultural sexism in an area might well be part of the reason why girls are needing therapy. And now they're going out and seeking therapy. If you're in a cultural sexist place, you're fighting the norms of the community. So it wouldn't work as well. So I think there you're putting a Band-Aid on a problem. And so this is why people who are suffering because of being deviant in some way in the local culture, at least traditionally, if I can find my way out of there, I'm going to get out of there. So I'm not sure about the alternative. I mean, I think that if you've got a sea change of norms, would people move back? Not necessarily. I think it's a reason for immigration. I don't think I answered your question. Ask it again. Okay.
But I'm thinking about how the norm, not just but how the norms of the surrounding culture and themselves be cues that support both automatic processes, but also support control processes. So others have the same.
Well, okay, so yeah, right.
Then does that
right.
help
Ally building. So I like that. So now you start to see an instance of sexual minority bashing, and you speak up, and other people in the environment join you. Yeah, you shouldn't be doing that to this person, and that's in fact a lot of them people were instructing people who want to intervene to do. Look for allies, and then boom, in that situation, at least you're controlling it. So people learn to identify the bad behavior. Now it becomes possible to intervene and make things better. Sure.
Sort of curious about the whole idea of the how to with me. And I think about my navigation. On most automatic habits. I don't think I can tell you the last time I did it fully unconscious. So I'm just curious where, like at what point do automatic behavior intentional? Is that something?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can give you direct evidence on that. When does it become so automatic you just lose intentionality at all? Most of the studies on this are showing that it's around 60, 70 days that you get that level of automaticity when they're starting a new behavior, new habit. I think the nail biting example you just gave is probably a childhood habit. So it's starting when you're 3 or something, and sort of like the teddy bear thing. It's reassuring to you that probably it's the reinforcement, the reward value is the pleasure you get out of controlling that. Gives you something to do, whatever. I mean, there are lots of ways to think about it. And so I mean, this is back to the developmental side of it again. I think if these things are happening at crucial phases of development, I think they're going to be even harder to change. It's more deep set. It's more of the brain's going to be already aligned behind that habit. Now it's a cerebellum problem, probably. I mean, it could also be beautiful. This is why if prodigies who start very young playing piano can do it, because they're training their brain at a much deeper level earlier. So yeah, I think sometimes we have to be a little, maybe you need a bigger intervention if you want to break that habit. Dip them in bitter solutions or something, or spicy or something like that. Because it has other problems. I mean, if you've ever chopped peppers and then you touch your eyes, you might suffer for a long time. So look out. Hara?
Whether or not you think there sudden change instead of gradual. you see that at the cultural level, dogs can all of a sudden shift when they at least they appear to shift very quickly to respond to the shocks. Is there anything like that?
No, I think I was thinking casing mask wearing in Asia is so normative and automatic, like it's become for us now in the West. And I remember visiting China, and I'm watching people who live there walking around with masks, and I'm the visitor, and I'm not masked. From a public health perspective, I'm the one who should be wearing a mask. What if I carried something in? Now, I'm the super spreader of that walking around. Me traveling out here, kind of the same thing. It's reassuring to get negative COVID tests. And like, well, it doesn't look like I'm carrying COVID. And now at least I don't have that weighing on me as I'm interacting with you. That would drive me crazy. So, I could just reflect more case study like with that example, like here we are a year and a half, almost 2 years in, and in the West, we've gotten automatic with masks. I mean, watching you guys on campus, all the students, just so 100% inside, maybe outside it's not supposed to be. I think it's gotten so automatic that it's there. And now, and then the latest mutant variety of COVID shows up, well, I guess we've got to be careful again, and up the mask goes. So, but I think also it's a biased sample of reality because people on university campuses are probably more in control, more conscientious, less neurotic. And so all of the things that I talked about would go into it as well. And then how long would it take to, I mean, in the States, especially, we see all these protests about masks. That's not new. Back in the 1918 to 19 pandemic, the so-called Spanish epidemic, flu epidemic, they had protests then too. So all the experts were basically predicting the same thing, and indeed it happened. Yeah, sure, please. You're first.
So I remember you talking about reward, but how much have you looked into the opposite?
Painful.
So in this case, with
Yeah.
masks, it's not just that it's a habit.
Well, social norms are painful if you're not conforming, right? From a long time ago, the Far Side cartoon would make fun of these things. Gary Larson, Professor Leibowitz is sitting in an auditorium and he realizes he's forgotten his duck. Masks exactly like that. And I almost left my office downstairs here without my mask. It's just like, I don't want the punishment of the social norm on me. So I think the norms are definitely actively engaging this. So I think, I don't know how strict that is over time. And I remember a year plus ago, going to the gym, and the gym had just reopened, and there are these people walking around with their noses exposed, and I finked on one of them one time, and so they have the attendant come up, and you've got to wear your mask all the way over your nose. That's how it works. So I mean, there are formal ways that institutions would be involved in this process too. So it's not just groups. Mandates, I think, really are important. And I was like, right before the Delta variant started to take over in the States, I was saying, yes, please, we've got to have the mandates, because it's sending a signal that it's objective truth and not something that's up to interpretation. So now you have people getting vaccinated because they're forced to stay at work. Good. Oh, there was another. Yeah.
And I wonder if this is sort of asymmetrical, where it seems to be super easy to sustain bad habits, but it might be very difficult to sustain good habits.
Yeah, that's the classic problem.
Like, I'm not sure how many of us have been on Duolingo and started to learn a new language, and have learned that language 4 times. And we still stagnate at a certain point. And the same as we do for exercise. If you can initially build this habit, and what when you say, gym, you start muscling up, and that's good, but then half a year later, it keep going. Whereas unhealthy snacking is a habit that's super easy to keep going.
Well, so we didn't talk about affordances. And so I spent a year in France. And my girls were 3.5 and 5. And at least back then, the French had really bad snacks between meals. And traditionally, their meals are heartier. You don't really need a snack between meals. So their culture did not afford the salty snacks, the sweet snacks, the way that American culture does, for example. So affordances there's a lot of research on affordances. They generally don't talk about habits, but a situation that affords a behavior makes it a lot easier. And in Europe, there's some steps that are arranged like musical, a scale, like a piano keyboard. Now, instead of taking the elevator, people go up the stairs and they make music. You're making exercise more likely, you're affording it. A vacuum cleaner affords vacuuming behavior. If you don't have the vacuum cleaner, you don't do it. I look at that as making things simpler. It's more of an engineering factor. But what they're doing is anticipating what your skills are. And the marketers would anticipate that if I put sugar in my product, I'm going to make it more addictive. It's an easy way that they know that your sensations value that. That it rewards you. So one reason the bad habit side is more attractive than the good habits is the marketers have figured out how to make it more rewarding. And they also are now making it so that all the good things are there. I don't want to blame what we've got out here. So I mean, me trying to be plant-based with a diet, so if you surround me with plant-based food that's tasty, I'm going to eat plant-based food. If it's not so tasty, I'm going to start looking for alternatives. It's exactly the same principle. So there's the secret of the dark side, if you will. Is there a follow-up question to thinking about that? Yeah.
The centrality of the natural community. I wonder if that over time, with the loneliness epidemic and more people being fully disconnected from any kind of community, is this lever decreasing in the power to get more and more difficult to reach? Generally, I think your talk, and especially the slide that's up there, to me suggests that if you do targeted policies on a regional level, for example, culturally attentive, that we could be very powerful push. If we have more and more people that aren't really connected to the community, how do we reach those?
That sounded really intelligent. But I want you to say it again.
I think my point is that if I understand your model correctly, it's sort of you have the individual and the community, or like the network.
Yep.
And as far as interventions are concerned, the network really is sort of where we use the lever to sort of try to engage behavior. And my question is, in this world where I would look at it correctly, more and more people are increasingly disconnected from any kind of community.
Oh, okay, good question. Yeah.
I think COVID might have amplified that for certain people.
Right.
And this initially extends far beyond this talk. I guess this is something that policymakers start with. There's more and more people that are left behind people. How do we reach those?
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it's a bit of a threat to sort of the beauty of the rest of this model, where otherwise I think this is a rare example of something with alignment who could use psychological insights to directly engender behavior change in these groups.
Yeah, so if I were to recap your question, I still think it's intelligent, by the way, very intelligent. It's that with people not connected, disconnected with groups, then the norms should have less power. At least that's the way it would look. There might be people who deny influence of the groups more than actual. And so a network individual resource model would try to measure both sides of the equation and see if they're actually reciprocal or not. And then examine it over time and find out that people are in denial or something. So in America, we're so fond of being, the rugged individualist kind of thing. That's denial in part. That's saying groups don't matter, when in fact they do. So it's motivated reasoning. So they might, on the surface of it, deny that the group matters, but then still conform, but think that they're doing it for their own reasons. And you guys know more about this than me, probably. So yeah.
I think the community is super hard because we're disconnected, but also reconnected to all these micro niche digital communities.
Right, fragmented. Oh, yeah.
TikTok is
Yeah.
also like perpetuating a lot of like language changes, there's a lot of things happening. So even talking about communities and how do you even like target a person's own micro niche community they're a part of is really difficult.
Well, you've heightened the social norm side of things too, like TikTok. I mean, I'll let myself look at it like once a week because I find I'll lose an hour without realizing an hour is gone. I thought it's 5 minutes, it's an hour, you know, just powerfully addictive. It's like a weekend thing to do when I know my time is not as valuable. But so I have something, if I find myself doing it accidentally, then it's gone too far. But think about the power of networking there. That's how you get big change. And you know, in the US elections last year, TikTok was doing a lot of great stuff, I thought. Probably doing a lot of bad stuff too. So it just depends which side you're looking at and what forces. But it's, you know, today it's easier than ever to contact and find networks that matter. And then the, you know, influencers within those, and this is network individual resource model, they're a network. And now people in the group, really network individual resource model is a old-fashioned Levinian field theory where we've taken group socialization models and put them in with individual level models of behavior. So if you think of group socialization models, you've got people playing different roles at different stages of being in a group. You're a new member of a group, you're not a leader. But you've got more established people in the group, and they are the leaders. And so the people with lots of followers have that history, and therefore the credibility in that network, and they're the ones who have the big power. And then boom, what they say goes, even if it isn't the truth, and misinformation or truth can be spread very easily this way. Fortunately, the truth is more boring. So the reward value isn't there. So the misinformation is often more valuable than what reality is. So sometimes reality is just boring, I'm sorry.
Thank you so much. I think we're